Lone Pine Battle, which is the one most well known, I guess, to most Australians, started on 6th of August, late in the afternoon on the 6th of August, as the kind of the beginning or diversionary attack at the beginning of the August offensive. The aim was that an Australian attack here would draw Turkish forces away from the northern part of the offensive that occurred up at the Neck and at Çanakkale, and all of that that was considered the main attack. This attack here would be a diversion and would keep Turkish forces tied to this point. Right behind me at the very end of the cemetery would have been the rough location of the Australian trenches, and probably roughly where that pine tree is today, according to our guide, would have been the location of the Turkish trenches, many of which had actually been boarded over or roofed over with pine logs. There's a pine forest behind us here that probably did exist still at the time. Those Australian soldiers dug tunnels that led them right up close to the Turkish trenches, and then they cut open the tops of their tunnels and burst out and surprised the Turkish defenders, and within half an hour's battle late on that day, they managed to actually take a significant amount of the Turkish trenches that were here available. And then of course what they expected would happen did happen. For the next 3 days there was constant counterattacks and attacks again as Turkish troops were drawn into the area. Australian troops were drawn in as well, and in fact for a time the Turkish troops were diverted from some of the attacks that were coming out of up in the north. There was some Australian angst, however, at the fact that very few British soldiers up in Suvla Bay failed to actually take advantage of the fact that there were very few Turkish troops in front of them, failed to exploit the success that the Australians had provided to them. And in the end, once the fighting started to die down here, Turkish forces were able to go up and settle into the high ground around Suvla Bay and pretty much contain the British offensive up there. This position that was then gained, one of the few Australian victories in the campaign, is a very exposed position. If you look over to me to the right, you can see that we're actually in quite a high position. We can see right down to the coastline, and even though we can't see it behind us, that way, behind the camera, that shrubbery, which wouldn't have been there, would have led to a perfect view over to the next valley and the third ridge, but also made this a significantly exposed view. The next 2 or 3 months while Australian troops held these trenches, they were in a place where they were under constant artillery fire. They managed to win a battle here, but again, to very little gain. But now this cemetery is perhaps the main one for Australians that were here today. People come here to commemorate the Gallipoli battle. There are soldiers from about another dozen or so burial sites around the place who were brought here and buried. Most of those graves down at the far end are people who died throughout the Gallipoli area, the Anzac area. In the middle, where our guide is currently walking, there's a whole number of people who died in this spot on the day of the landing. And then these rows of graves here closest to us are the men who died in the 1st Brigade in between August 6th and August 9th. Again, it's very peaceful here, very peaceful today. To think of what was going on here in August 1915, it sort of seems so surreal. Oh, yeah, over here there's a little bit.
Sean, something falls on your jacket.
Lieutenant Colonel Alexander White, and he went in the first wave at the Neck and died immediately, and he was followed by many of these soldiers.
Yeah, he done it again, Mom.
And their bodies are lost. They're still unidentified over in the Neck cemetery, so they don't have gravestones. But all of those young men, or many of them, would have been Western Victorians. It'd be lovely to think that the one lone single pine that's actually standing here was the original lone pine. Sadly, it's unlikely to have been the case. We're pretty sure, historians are pretty sure, that Lone Pine is named after, indeed, a single pine that was planted here, that the first soldiers saw on their first day of landing here. But we're also reasonably sure that within a few days of that, that tree was cut down and Turkish soldiers used the logs from that tree to, to board up over their trenches. Eventually, after the war, when these cemeteries were consecrated, replanted, redesigned, if you like, there was always efforts to keep a single pine tree planted here. Unfortunately, a couple of them burnt down in bushfires that came through the area, and it's believed that this one that's here today was planted in the 60s, and our guide actually remembers when it was a young sapling. And so, but it still makes a really lovely counterpoint to the cemetery.